They gave us the end of the line and called it a gift. Vethspur Terminus sat at the outer edge of the compact's mapped corridor network, 312 light hours from the nearest populated way station. At the cold terminus of a freight spur, the compact had decommissioned 11 years before we arrived. The station itself was a cylindrical transit hub, 400 meters long, originally built to service ore extraction convoys from the Kess outer belt. The extraction had failed, the convoys had stopped, and the station had sat dark and pressureless for a decade before the compact's resettlement authority decided it was a suitable home for 83,000 displaced human beings. The formal decree described it as a permanent resettlement zone with full corridor access rights. What it was, practically, was the compact telling humanity to go somewhere quiet and stop making the central stations uncomfortable. We were, in the polite formulation of the authority's chief administrator, a displaced population requiring managed transition support. In the less polite formulation that I heard from a Vethrani port official the day our first transport requested docking clearance, we were a problem the corridor would rather not have noticed. I was 41 years old when our first transport docked at Terminus. I had been a logistics coordinator for the compact's humanitarian aid division for 16 years, which meant I knew how to read a supply manifest, understand a welfare regulation, file a registration in the format the compact's administrative apparatus would accept, and distinguish between a bureaucratic process that was designed to help people and one that was designed to make helping people sufficiently difficult that they would eventually stop asking. I had no family remaining after the dispersal. I had 2 bags of personal items and a portable filing unit with 3 years of backup storage capacity. That was everything I brought. The first thing I did when I walked through the docking collar and into the station's dead, cold air was open a new log file. I noted the date, the time, the docking collar number, the vessel registry of the transport, and the names of the 14 other administrators who came through the collar behind me. I noted the state of the main corridor, cold, dark, station pressure holding at 62%, emergency lighting active in the primary ring only, 3 habitat modules in the secondary ring displaying structural compromise flags on the status board. I noted the temperature, 11 degrees below the compact's minimum habitability standard. I noted what we had brought with us and what we had not. Then I went to work. I want to be careful about how I describe the next several years, because people who were not there tend to imagine something heroic about them. There was nothing heroic about the early period at Terminus. There was welding. There was pipe work. There was an almost metaphysical quantity of paperwork. There was cold. There was the specific and unrelenting fatigue of people who are doing the work of keeping several thousand other people alive, while simultaneously trying to make the place where they are doing it structurally sound enough to keep doing it in for the foreseeable future. We had arrived with 3 fabrication units, 17 tons of raw composite material, a 12-month supply of protein rations, 4 portable medical units, 1 qualified surgeon, 2 general practitioners, a structural engineer, a hydroponic specialist who had worked on colony stations before the dispersal, and enough administrative personnel to run a station about 1/4 the size of what Terminus would become. The compact had provided these resources as part of our resettlement package. They had also provided a single welfare liaison officer, a Vethrani named Keth Oren who visited once every 3 months to file a status report and then depart. He was unfailingly pleasant. He was entirely certain that, within 2 years, the human population at Terminus would have drifted back into the corridor interior and distributed itself among whatever stations would accept individual families, which was what the compact expected would happen. It is what had happened with every previous displaced population the authority had resettled at marginal stations. The stations were chosen for their unsuitability. The resources provided were minimal enough to sustain life but insufficient to build. The expectation was attrition. The expectation was wrong about us, but not because we were exceptional. We were not exceptional. We were angry, which is different. Angry people with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose are not the same as hopeful people building toward a future. We were not, in those first years, particularly hopeful. We were stubborn, which is the thing anger becomes when it has nowhere useful to go and decides instead to become structural. Every 3 months Keth Oren came to Terminus, conducted his inspection, asked his standardized questions, filed his report. Every 3 months I handed him a copy of our internal record for that period: births, deaths, welfare registrations, structural modification logs, and eventually, as the years progressed, commercial registry entries and treaty of cohabitation filings for the non-human workers and traders who had begun arriving in our second year. The end of the line is, it turns out, a useful place to conduct business if you want to conduct it without the central station's commercial oversight apparatus watching every transaction. Word travels in the corridor network. By year 2, Orathi traders were using our secondary ring for informal exchange. By year 3, a Sorethi extended family had filed for residential status, which I registered under Welfare Section 4 and noted in the record. Keth Oren always took the copies I provided. I do not believe he ever read them. That was fine. The copies existed. The record existed. That was the point. By the end of year 4, Terminus had air in all 4 original rings, gravity in 3, and a population of 9,211, of which 8,640 were human, and the remainder were Vithrani, Orathi, Sorethi, and Keth-adjacent workers and their families. We had a functional medical bay, a school with an enrollment of 412 children, a fabrication cooperative that had begun producing structural composite at commercial quality, a food-growing operation in the outer ring managed by our hydroponic specialist, and 3 Sorethi agricultural workers he had recruited in year 2, and a commerce exchange board in the secondary ring that was processing approximately 40 registered transactions per day. We also had a child named Sale. She arrived in the 7th month of year 3 on a Vithrani diplomatic transport that had suffered a cascade failure in its life support array somewhere in the outer belt. The transport had enough emergency power to reach the nearest pressurized facility. The nearest pressurized facility was us. They docked at 2 in the morning, station time, and I was the administrator on call because the administrator on call was always me. There were 9 people aboard the transport, 7 adults, the diplomatic family, their domestic staff, and a protocol aide, and 2 children. The older child, a boy of perhaps 12, was shaken but physically unaffected. The younger one was not fine. She was small, even by the standards of Vithrani children, with ash-gray skin that had taken on a bluish undertone from the cold, and oversized amber eyes that were open and tracking when I came through the hatch, but clouded with the particular unfocused quality of a child, whose body has been working too hard to stay warm and has been doing it for several hours. Her mother, a composed, silver-haired woman in travel clothes who I would later understand, was considerably more important than her practical clothing suggested, had wrapped the child in every garment available, and was holding her against her own body for warmth. The transport's emergency thermal reserve had been close to fully exhausted. I carried her to the medical bay. Not because I am particularly strong, or because I had made a deliberate assessment of the situation and concluded that carrying her myself was the optimal response. I came through the hatch and she was there, and she was cold and small, and I picked her up. That is the whole of the decision-making process. She was light in a way that alarmed me. She had small pointed ears pressed flat against her head. She did not make a sound. She looked at me with those amber eyes that were not quite focused, and I carried her down the corridor to the medical bay and handed her to Haran Saul, our surgeon, who had come out of the bay at the alert and who took over without a word because he was Haran Saul and he did not require instruction. He worked on her for 4 hours. The child's mother, Sen, junior diplomatic attaché of the Thrani Second House, traveling in an unofficial capacity with her family, waited outside the bay in the careful stillness of a person who is holding themselves together by force of discipline. I brought her tea. I sat with her. I had nothing useful to say and therefore said nothing, which turned out to be the correct choice. Heron came out at dawn. The child would be fine. Controlled warming, nutritional support, 1 week of monitoring. Entirely fine. Sen took both of my hands in both of hers and held them for a moment and said a word in Thrani that I did not know. I asked her later. She said it meant approximately, the person who keeps the light from going out. But that the concept in Thrani was inseparable from the act of staying present when the light is in danger. That the word was not an honorific but a description of a specific and recognized type of action. The transport could not be repaired at Terminus. We lacked the required components. Sen filed for a replacement vessel with the Compact's diplomatic registry, which told her 4 to 6 weeks, corridor scheduling permitting. I registered the family as temporary residents under Welfare Section 4, which gave them full station access and ration rights. Sail was up on the 4th day. She was sitting on a medical bay cot with a wool blanket around her shoulders and a cup of warm grain broth that she was examining with what I can only describe as forensic seriousness. She had her mother's stillness. She had eyes that recorded everything and gave very little back. When I arrived to check the family's registration paperwork, she looked at me steadily and said, in careful compact standard that had the slightly formal quality of a child who has learned a language properly rather than by immersion, "You are the one who carried me." I said yes. She considered this. That was a correct decision, she said. I told her I was glad she thought so. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to examining her broth. The replacement transport did not come in 4 weeks. It did not come in 6. The diplomatic registry cited corridor congestion, scheduling backlogs, and 3 separate technical reasons that were each individually plausible and collectively suspicious. Sen accepted the delays with considerably more patience than I would have. I kept the family's registration current. I extended it every 14 days, automatically, noting the extension in the welfare record. The weeks accumulated. The children enrolled in the station school because a child cannot sit in a temporary habitation unit for 2 months without consequences, and the school was there and was operational and had space. Sail was, as it turned out, extraordinary at everything she turned her attention to. Our structural coordinator, Bram Kettler, discovered this in the 4th week when she asked him for the station's architectural plans, and then spent 3 weeks annotating them with questions. He came to my office with the annotated plans and told me she had identified 2 load path inefficiencies in the secondary ring bracing and 1 thermal regulation problem in the outer ring junction that he had been planning to address as soon as he had time, which he had not had, and which she had located independently by reading the plans and the maintenance logs. She was 8 years old. Bram said this with the expression of a man who was not sure whether to be impressed or unsettled, and had decided to be both. She came to the records office in the 6th week and asked if she could have a copy of the station's master registry filing because she wanted to understand how the documentation system worked. I gave her a copy. I explained the system. It was not a lesson I planned. It was a conversation that happened because she asked intelligent questions and I gave honest answers. That was all it was. The replacement transport arrived in the 14th week. By then Sail had memorized the layout of all 4 rings, learned 43 words of Orathi from the family in Habitat Cluster 7, mastered the registration system to a degree that should have taken an adult 6 months, and asked me on 3 separate occasions whether the station's habitation code specified that permanent residents had to be human. Each time I told her it did not. Each time she nodded and said thank you and went back to whatever she had been doing. On the morning the transport came, Sen appeared in the records office in V. Thrani House colors, dark blue and silver, formal and precise, the clothes of a person resuming an official identity. She thanked me again. She said Sale had spoken of me every morning since recovering. She said the word Sale used for me was the same one Sen herself had used outside the medical bay on the first morning. Then she took her children aboard the transport, and it undocked and cleared the approach lane, and I stood in the observation port and watched it go. And then I went back to the records office and noted the departure in the welfare registry with date, time, and destination, the way I noted everything. I did not think I would see Sale again. I turned out to be wrong about this, but I did not know that yet. The years after that were about building. Not dramatically, continuously. One decision at a time, one welded section at a time, one filed form at a time, the school grew. The medical bay was extended into a full hospital with 4 surgical suites and a training program that produced, over the next decade, 11 qualified medical practitioners from within the station's own population. The food-growing operation was restructured in year 6 by a Sorethi agricultural engineer named Vel who had arrived looking for a short-term contract and had stayed permanently. When he realized that the sole composite system we had developed in the outer ring was more sophisticated than anything currently in use in the commercial corridor. The fabrication cooperative grew to employ 312 people by year 10 and was producing structural composite at a quality rating that the Compact's own supply division inquired about purchasing. I told them the price. They found it acceptable. We kept the contract. I want to say something about the record keeping, because it is the part of what we did that people who were not at Terminus have the most difficulty understanding. Every human civilization in history, everyone without exception, has kept records. Cave walls, clay tablets, papyrus, paper, digital storage. The medium changes, the impulse does not. We are not a species that allows things to pass undocumented. We are constitutionally, almost compulsively incapable of it. We notice what happens. We write it down. We file the paper. We build the archive. When you have nothing else, when everything has been stripped from you, your world, your standing, your political recognition, your place in the order of things, you still have the ability to write down what happened when it happened and to whom. You still have the ability to say, this occurred, and here is the record of it, and the record exists, and you may try to argue with it, but you cannot make it not have happened. That is what we did for 47 years. Every birth at Terminus from day 1 was entered into the registry with date, time, the names of both parents if known, the habitat unit number, and the name of the attending medical professional. Every death the same. Every commercial agreement, every structural modification, every treaty of cohabitation with resident non-human families, every welfare registration, every school enrollment, every council election, every voted amendment to the station's governing constitution. Everything in the format the Compact's administrative apparatus required, cross-referenced and indexed, and backed up in triplicate, digital, physical, and a secured relay copy 2 corridor hours from the station that I had established in year 2, and that I had told exactly 3 people about. I did not know, at the time, that this record would become the most important thing humanity had ever built in the outer corridor. I was keeping it because it was correct to do so, and because I am constitutionally incapable of not doing it. That is the honest answer. Keth Oren continued to visit every 3 months for 7 years, and then his position was eliminated in an administrative restructuring, and we received a new liaison who came once per year, then twice per year. The visits became increasingly perfunctory. The status reports were always the same: population nominal, welfare status nominal, no significant incidents requiring authority attention. The resettlement authority received these reports and filed them. I do not believe anyone read them with care. This was fine, the copies existed, the record existed. In year 11, A compact survey vessel doing routine corridor mapping filed a report noting that Terminus appeared to be a functioning transit hub with significant infrastructure development, representing a substantially more permanent installation than its encampment designation would suggest. The survey officer recommended a formal status review. The authority acknowledged the report and filed it. In year 14, we submitted a formal application for reclassification under Section 7 of the Compact's Corridor Habitation Code, recognized transit station, with sovereign zone designation. I wrote most of the application myself. It ran to 4,700 pages of supporting documentation, including 14 years of unbroken registry records. The authority acknowledged the application and filed it. In year 19, we submitted the application again, with 22 years of record now attached. We received, for the first time, a written response. Under review, determination expected within the standard review period of 1 to 3 years. 3 years passed, then 5 more. In year 27, a delegation from the Resettlement Authority arrived at Terminus unannounced on a compact administrative vessel. 6 people, all senior coordinators, all in dark gray administrative coats. Their lead was Principal Coordinator Velsoreth, the person whose specific function in the Compact's administrative structure was deciding what displaced population installations got to remain and what got dispersed. I met them at the docking collar. I want to describe Terminus at that moment because it matters to understand what they walked into. The station had 4 complete rings plus a partial 5th ring at 70% completion. Population was 31,208 permanent residents, of which approximately 22,000 were human and 9,000 were Vithrani, Orathi, Sorethi, and other corridor species. All registered, all documented, all present by legal process and recorded welfare status. We had a hospital, a university with 3 faculties, a fabrication cooperative with export contracts to 4 corridor stations, including 2 compact licensed commercial hubs. We had a legal services office. We had a diplomatic reception facility used twice for inter-house negotiations because Terminus was known, by then, as a place where the record was kept correctly and the agreements made there were honored. We had a council of 11 elected members governing station affairs under a written constitution that had been in operation since year 7. The constitution was on the record. Every vote on every amendment was on the record. We also had, in the records office, a deputy administrator named Sale. She had arrived 3 years before the delegation, at age 22, on a freight hauler out of the Veth corridor interior. She had a certification in Logistics Systems Administration from the Vithrani Institute of Applied Corridor Studies. She had a letter from her mother, addressed to me, which said simply, "She has been trying to reach Terminus since she was 8 years old. She understands your documentation system better than most adults who have spent careers in it. I told her to come, and she said she had already booked the passage." She had presented herself at my office door with her certification documents in order, her transit records current, her welfare registration already completed via the remote filing system. She had done it herself, correctly, from the corridor, and asked if there was a position available in records administration. I hired her the same afternoon. I did not tell her that I had kept a copy of her childhood welfare registration in a separate file for 22 years because I could not bring myself to archive it. That would have been an unusual thing to say to a new employee. She was precise, tireless, and systematically smarter about the documentation architecture than anyone we had. Within 6 months, she had redesigned the indexing system. Within a year, she had identified 3 compliance gaps in our commercial registration filings that would have been a problem if the authority had ever looked carefully, and had corrected them. Within 2 years, she had been promoted twice and was, functionally, the person who ran the records office day to day. I provided oversight. She provided the actual administration. Velsoreth and her 5 coordinators came through the docking collar and I walked them through the station. I showed them nothing out of order. I did not prepare any special presentation. The station looked the way it looked on any other afternoon, busy, organized, functional, the permanent and unremarkable evidence of 27 years of people living and working and building in a place they had decided was theirs. Children in the corridor near the school block, the particular smell of the food cooperatives, harvest processing drifting from the outer ring vents, the sound of fabrication work, commerce happening at the exchange board. A council notice posted on the community board in Ring 2 about the partial fifth ring completion schedule and the residential lottery for the new habitat units. Ordinary life, going about itself. Vel Sareth said very little during the tour. She was a compact, precise woman, about 10 years my senior, silver-haired, with the practiced expressionlessness of a senior administrator who has spent a career making decisions with significant consequences, and who has learned to do her thinking without letting it show. I recognized the quality. I had spent 27 years developing exactly the same one. I brought them to the records office. Sale was at the processing desk when we arrived, completing a commercial registration amendment. She finished it, stamped it, filed it, then stood and turned to face the delegation. Vel Sareth looked at her for a moment. "You are not human," the principal coordinator said. "No," Sale said. "I was born Vithrani. I'm a permanent resident of Terminus under the station's habitation code, with 3 years of documented residency and a registered welfare status prior to that extending to age 8. I hold a station identification card." She produced it, held it out. Vel Sareth took it, examined it, returned it without comment. "I am the deputy records administrator for this station." Vel Sareth looked at me. I said, "She is very good at it." Then I sat down, and I went through the record. Not quickly, not selectively. From the beginning, Day 1, the 14 administrators through the docking collar, the state of the station at arrival, the first population count, the first welfare registrations, the first structural modification log entries. Year by year I walked them through it. Every significant entry flagged and cross-referenced. Every structural change filed with the corridor authority as required. Every commercial registration formatted under compact commercial code as required. Every treaty of cohabitation, every school enrollment year, every birth, every death properly documented in the format required. Every application for reclassification, 4 applications, filed in years 14, 19, 22, and 25, with submission dates and acknowledgement dates, and the specific provisions of Section 7 that each application satisfied. The delegation looked at the filing stacks. Vel Sareth asked to see the physical backup storage. Sale took her to the back room. The physical archive occupied floor-to-ceiling shelving on 4 walls of a room 12 meters by 8, temperature-controlled, humidity-controlled, organized by year and category, and cross-referenced to the digital index. 47 years of Terminus, in composite fiber archival cases, every one of them labeled and accessible. Vel Sareth asked how much physical documentation we maintained. Sale said, without inflection, 47 years of operational record in physical archival format, cross-referenced with digital storage, with a third redundant copy maintained on a secured relay 2 corridor hours from the station. The relay copy is updated every 72 hours. 3 copies, Vel Sareth said. 3 copies, Sale confirmed. There was a silence. I will explain what the silence contained, because it is the legal heart of what happened next. Under Section 7 of the Compacts Corridor Habitation Code, a resettlement encampment may be reclassified as a provisional habitation zone after 10 years of continuous documented occupation. A provisional habitation zone may be upgraded to a recognized corridor station after 20 additional years of continuous documented occupation with demonstrated commercial viability and governance structure. a recognized corridor station that has existed for a total of 40 years with unbroken documentation, demonstrated governance, and commercial registry activity, may not be dispersed, relocated, or reclassified downward without a formal judicial review by the Compact's Corridor Authority Board, requiring a 3/5 majority of the full board, which had not been convened for a corrective action in 31 years and whose members were distributed across 12 stations. Terminus had been continuously documented for 47 years. This was not an accident. I had read Section 7 in its entirety in year 2 of our residence, when I began to understand what the authorities' long-term intention for humanity at Terminus actually was. I had structured every filing, every registration, every maintenance log entry, every commercial registration, every welfare record, to satisfy Section 7's specific requirements at each stage. I had never deviated from the format. I had never let the record lapse. I had built, one piece of paper at a time, over the course of 27 years of deliberate administrative work, a legal foundation that the Compact's own code protected absolutely. I had not told many people this was what I was doing. The Council knew from year 7 onward. Haran Saul knew. Bram Kettler knew. But I had not made a public announcement of the strategy, because the strategy only worked if the record was kept correctly regardless of whether people understood why. And the best way to ensure it was kept correctly was to ensure the people keeping it believed, accurately, that it mattered on its own terms, which it did. The Compact had built a legal code that protected established communities because established communities are, historically, easier to administer than displaced ones. They had not, I think, imagined that the displaced community they placed at the end of the line would spend 47 years becoming an established one. They had expected us to drift away. We had stayed. We had kept every record. Vel Soreth returned to the main office and sat across the desk from me. The delegation's other members were quiet in the way of people who have arrived prepared for one kind of conversation and found themselves in a different one. Vel Soreth looked at the filing stacks along the wall with an expression I had worn myself, more than once, the expression of someone who has been recalibrating their understanding of a situation and has just completed the recalibration. She said, "You knew from the beginning that this day would come." I said, "From day one." She said, "The resettlement decree was intended to be a temporary measure." I said, "I know, I read it very carefully." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with something in her voice that I recognized as the beginning of professional respect, the kind that forms between two people who see the same discipline at work in each other, she said, "How many of the original 83,000 are still in residence?" I told her the figures. About a third had remained continuously. Many others had left and returned, their departures and arrivals documented each time. The first generation born at Terminus was now in its late 20s and early 30s. The second generation was in school. She looked at Sale. Sale said, "I arrived here at age 8 in a medical emergency. The station's administrator registered my family correctly under Welfare Section 4 and maintained the record. When I was old enough, I applied for residential status, completing the habitation code's full requirements." She paused. "The station's habitation code does not require residents to be human. Administrator Voss drafted the code herself in year 7 and included that provision deliberately." Vel Soreth said to me, "You drafted your own habitation code." I said, "Year 7. Council approved it. It is on the record with every vote." She said, "You understand that the documentation you have presented me constitutes a legally complete and unchallenged foundation for sovereign station status under Section 7, and that I have no administrative mechanism to dispute it." I said, "I have understood that since year 2. She looked at the filing stacks one more time. Then she reached into her documentation case and produced a form, the Compact Corridor Station Recognition Certificate, Form 7A, which is the instrument of formal recognition for new corridor stations with sovereign zone designation. Commercial rights, governance recognition, territorial boundaries, permanent status. The document a displaced population becomes a civilization with. She had brought it already prepared. She set it on the desk. She said the authority had reviewed the record on file, found it satisfactory under all Section 7 requirements, and that the form required only the certification signature and station identification code assignment to be legally complete. She had known before she arrived. She had read the record, finally, or someone beneath her had, and they had understood what the record said, and she had come with the paper that acknowledged it. I looked at Sale. "Deputy Administrator," I said. She looked at me. Station charter procedure requires all significant documents to be processed through the records office and stamped by the duty records officer before the administrative head countersigns. I kept my voice exactly level. That is the procedure. Something happened in Sale's expression. Very small, very contained. I had spent 3 years learning to read Vithrani emotional register, and I knew what I was looking at. She reached for the form. She read every word of it. She read the authorizing provisions, the designation clauses, the boundary language, the commercial rights article, the governance recognition paragraph, the permanent status clause. She read it the way she read everything completely, with attention to each word's specific meaning. Then she reached for the processing stamp, the one that had been sitting on that desk since year 4. The one that had stamped 47 years of Terminus into legal existence, one entry at a time. She stamped the form. She slid it back across the desk to me. I countersigned it. I noted the date, the time, the document reference number, and the names of all parties present. Then I opened the registry and entered it as Terminus entry number 844,216. Velsarth staff completed the station identification code assignment and transmitted it to the Corridor Authority's central registry, propagation time approximately 6 hours. By morning, every navigation chart in the Compact's network would show Veth Spur Terminus as a recognized corridor station, sovereign zone, permanent status. The delegation stayed for dinner. It was an ordinary dinner, the kind the station's cooperative kitchen produces every evening, competent and filling, assembled from what the outer ring grows. Sale sat across from Velsarth's junior coordinator and talked about the indexing system for most of the meal. I sat at the end of the table and drank tea and listened to the station around me. The shift change sounds from the fabrication floor. Voices in the corridor. The reliable, regular thrum of the atmospheric processors doing what they had done every day for 47 years. 31,000 people living their lives in a place that was theirs now, legally and permanently and on the record. After dinner, I walked Velsarth back to the docking collar. At the collar, she stopped and turned to me. She said, "How did you know? That they would come for you eventually, that the intention was dispersal." I said, "I have been a logistics coordinator for a long time. I know how administrative systems handle problems they want to disappear. You assign the problem a space at the margin. You give it minimal resources. You wait for it to resolve on its own. That approach works with most problems." I looked at the corridor walls around us, at 47 years of composite and alloy and human labor. We were not most problems. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the third copy, the relay backup. I said yes. She said, "When did you establish it?" "Year 2, I told her." She nodded slowly, the nod of a calculation completing. She said, "You were never uncertain this day would come." I said I was certain of the day. I was uncertain only of its form. I prepared for several forms. She extended her hand. I took it. We held the handshake a moment longer than formality required, which is what happens when two people who understand the same kind of work recognize it in each other. She said, "The record is remarkable." I said, It is 47 years of people doing their jobs. That is what it is. She went through the collar. I watched the vessel undock. I watched it clear the approach lane and enter the corridor line. I watched until the running lights disappeared into the dark. Then I went back to the records office. Sale was still there. She was at the processing desk with the master registry index open, the way she was most evenings. She looked up when I came in and waited. I sat across the desk from her. I said, "Entry 844,216, Sovereignty Recognition Certification. Verify and close." She pulled the entry. She read it through fully, the way she read everything. She verified the signatories, the document reference, the code assignment, the transmission confirmation, the authorizing provisions. She entered the verification notation in her precise, slightly too small handwriting. She closed the entry. Then she set the index aside and folded her hands on the desk and looked at me. I said, "You have been trying to get here since you were 8 years old." She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" Outside the records office, the station went about its evening. Fabrication floor change-of shift. Voices from the ring corridor. The faint, deep thrum of the atmospheric processors. The sounds of a place that had decided to exist and had kept deciding for 47 years. She said, "When I was 8 years old and cold and not entirely certain I would be all right, you came through the hatch and picked me up without being asked. You did not know who I was. You did not know what my family was. There was no reason for you to do it except that I was there and I needed it, and so you did." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about that for 14 years, about what kind of place produces that. What kind of people build that into themselves so completely that it is not a decision, it is just what you do." She looked down at the closed index. I wanted to be part of it. I did not say anything for a long time. Then I said, "You are on the record." She said, "I filed my own registration." I said, "I know you did. I checked it." Something changed in her expression. The very small, very contained thing. She looked at the filing stacks for a moment. She said, "You kept my welfare registration." I said, "In a separate file, 22 years. I could not put it in the closed archive." She thought about this. Then she said, quietly, the Vithrani word I had first heard from her mother's mouth outside the medical bay at dawn, 24 years ago. The word that means the person who keeps the light from going out. The word that is inseparable, in Vithrani, from the act of being present while the light is in danger. I said, "What does it feel like to be here?" She said, "Like being on the record." I said, "That is exactly what it feels like." We sat in the records office of Veth Spur Terminus for a while after that, while the station turned on its axis, and the filing stacks held 47 years of everything that had ever happened to us, and we did not say anything more, because the record was complete, and we were still here, and the light was still on. I want to say something about the people who built Terminus, because they deserve to be on the record too. Haran Saul, who had been the kind of trauma surgeon who operated in theater of conflict conditions for 12 years before the dispersal, and who spent the first 2 years at Terminus rebuilding our medical infrastructure from fabricated components and salvage, and who trained 11 more medical practitioners from within our own population over the following decade. Haran, who never once, in 27 years, left a patient's record incomplete, because he had the same disease I had, the inability to let something pass undocumented. Bram Kettler, our structural engineer, who spent the first 4 years of Terminus sleeping less than any human being should sleep, and who built the ring bracing system that a small gray-skinned girl with amber eyes would annotate with structural critiques 14 years later and find mostly sound. Bram, who invented, out of material necessity, 3 composite construction techniques that are now in standard use at stations throughout the outer corridor, and who refused every offer to move to a better resourced facility because he said the problems at Terminus were more interesting. Vel Sareth, no relation to the principal coordinator, the Sorethi agricultural engineer who arrived in year 6 for a 3-month contract and was still there in year 27, who had developed a closed-loop soul composite system that fed 30,000 people from the outer ring of a space station on the basis of 2 tons of seed stock and a great deal of patient experimentation. Davin Marsh, who ran the school from year 2 and who produced, over 25 years, a graduating population with literacy and mathematical competency, rates measurably higher than the compact's own core station averages, because Davin believed that you did not reduce your standards in difficult circumstances. You raised them, because the children needed to be better equipped for what they were going to face, not merely adequate. And the 83,000 who came, and the 31,000 who were still there, and the children of those 31,000 who had never lived anywhere else, and who therefore had no concept of terminus as a temporary solution or a marginal space or a place at the end of the line. They were third-generation terminus residents. They were home. I think about what the compact saw when they looked at our resettlement application in year 14 and decided to file it without response. I think they saw a displaced population making the best of a difficult situation and assumed that the best we could do was not very good. They had seen displaced populations before. They knew what displaced populations did. They survived for a generation, dispersed in the second, dissolved into the corridor's existing communities in the third. The pattern was established. The authority had resources and expertise premised on the pattern. We did not follow the pattern. I have thought, in the years since sovereignty recognition, about what made us different. I do not think it was suffering. We had suffered, but so had every other displaced population the compact had ever managed. I do not think it was intelligence or skill or determination in any unusual measure. I think it was, at its root, 2 things. The first was that we had nowhere else to go, not psychologically but practically. The compact's resettlement program did not come with a path back to the interior. There was no waiting list for reassignment to a better station. There was terminus, and there was the corridor, and the corridor did not want us. We had been told by every mechanism available to a bureaucratic system that we were not welcome in the places where things happened. So we made a place where things happened. You do when there is no alternative. The second was the records. I keep coming back to the records, and I want to be precise about why, because it is easy to describe record-keeping as a strategy, a legal maneuver, a deliberate construction of the conditions for sovereignty recognition, and it was that, but it was also something else. It was an act of insistence. Every entry in the registry was a statement that this had happened, that these people existed, that their lives and work and children and deaths were real and significant and worthy of documentation. Not because the compact valued them, not because anyone was watching, because they were real, because they had happened, because the human response to reality is to write it down. Every birth registered at terminus was a claim. This person exists. Every commercial agreement filed was a claim. This exchange was real and we stand behind it. Every structural modification logged was a claim. We built this with our hands and it is here. The record was not a strategy dressed up as bureaucracy. The record was, is, and will remain the truest thing we made. Everything else, the rings, the hospital, the school, the fabrication cooperative, the commercial exchange, the Constitution, the university, everything else was built on top of the record. The record was the foundation. Vel Sareth understood this, I think, when she walked through the back room and looked at the shelves. She was a person who had spent her career managing communities that had failed to build that foundation, communities that had accepted the compact's characterization of them as temporary, and had therefore remained temporary. She knew what she was looking at when she saw 47 years of archival cases, each one labeled and current and maintained. She knew, in that moment, that she had not come to disperse a refugee camp. She had come to formally recognize a civilization. I am glad she came prepared. In the weeks after the delegation's departure, I noticed something change in the station that I had not anticipated. Word traveled, the way word travels in a contained community, through the exchange board, through the school, through the corridors during shift change. People knew what had happened. People knew what entry 844,216 meant. Not everyone understood the legal architecture. I did not expect them to, but everyone understood the basic shape of what had occurred. They had tried to make us temporary, and we had not been. A woman named Sarath, who had been born at Terminus in year 2, and who managed the food cooperative's distribution logistics, came to the records office 3 days after the delegation left. She was 31 years old, which meant she had never lived anywhere else. She asked to see her own birth registration. I pulled it. Year 2, month 4. Her name, her parents' names, the habitat unit, Haran Saul's signature on the medical certification. Everything correct, everything present. I slid it across the desk to her. She read it. She read it slowly and carefully, the way people read things that are important to them. Then she looked up. She said, "I am on the record." I said yes. She said, "I have always been on the record." I said yes. Since the day she was born, that entry had been in the registry, and would remain in the registry for as long as Terminus stood. She sat with that for a moment, then she thanked me and left. That was when I understood what 47 years of documentation had actually built. Not a legal case, not a sovereignty argument, a foundation, not physical. The rings and corridors and composite walls were physical. The foundation, I mean, is the one people stand on when they need to know that where they are is real, that what they have built is real, that their lives in the place they have built are real and recognized and permanent. Sarath had been born at Terminus. The record said so. The record had always said so. And now, with sovereignty recognition filed and transmitted and propagating across the compact's navigation charts, the record also said that the place where she was born was permanent, was recognized, was hers and her children's and whoever came after. The record said, "You exist, you have always existed, you have always been here." That is what we built. That is what the 47 years produced. Not just the station. Anyone can build a station, given materials and time. We built the record of a people who refused to be temporary. And we built it carefully and correctly and completely, one entry at a time, until the compact's own legal structure had no choice but to agree. Sale understood this. She had understood it since she was 8 years old, sitting on a medical bay cot with broth and a blanket, asking me for a copy of the master registry filing because she wanted to know how the documentation system worked. She had grown up, studied, qualified, and traveled to the end of the line, literally, to the physical terminus of a decommissioned freight spur, because she wanted to be part of it. She is on the record. Entry 844,216 is on the record. 31,000 people are on the record. And when I go to the records office tomorrow morning, the way I have gone every morning for 27 years, I will open the log and note the date and the time, and the record will continue, because that is what the record does. It continues. We stay.